Welcome to Galveston Unscripted.
People were kind of buried in the sand dunes because that's where the Indians before us buried their dead. And you can imagine nature's sand dunes, that didn't work too well. But when we had our third yellow fever epidemic, they realized they needed a designated burial ground.
Well, it doesn't really matter. It's like you're probably stepping on someone's gravesite because there have been so many people buried in these cemeteries and kind of mixed and mingled in there.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Galveston Unscripted. On this episode, we sit down with Kathleen Maca, author of quite a few books. A couple we discussed today, Galveston's Broadway Cemeteries and A History of the Galvez Hotel. If this is your first time joining us, welcome to Galveston Unscripted. We are transforming Galveston into the world's largest free museum, and we're doing that one podcast at a time. Whether it's a short 3-minute audio guide or a long-form conversation like this one you're listening to today. The content from every one of these podcasts is added to an audio tour map to enhance your understanding and context while you're exploring Galveston, or if you're just trying to understand Texas and American history. Galveston played a very important role in the expansion and growth of Texas and the American West, and it still does today. Galveston Unscripted, the official podcast of Galveston and Galveston's award-winning podcast. We are here to preserve and promote history. We really dive into Galveston's cemeteries today, specifically Galveston's Broadway Cemetery Complex, where Kathleen gives tours and really has done a lot of research into many of the people buried there for almost 200 years. A lot of these people helped build Galveston, Texas, and even the United States. If you live on Galveston Island or you're just visiting and you're driving around, whether you're on 61st Street or Broadway, you're going to stumble upon some of Galveston's cemeteries. And like other cities like Key West and New Orleans, they strike you. A lot of mausoleums, a lot of carved, unique headstones. They scream affluence and importance. We also discuss some of Galveston's hidden cemeteries, some that have been lost to time, some that have just been blatantly forgotten, and we're going to highlight them here today. Galveston's Broadway Cemetery Complex is included in the National Register of Historic Places. Not just one headstone, the entire complex. Did you know that Galveston's Broadway Cemetery is 3 layers deep? Kathleen also gives tours of the downtown area and Galveston cemeteries, so be sure to check the link in the description for her tours and her books. Kathleen also explores the history of haunted Galveston. She recorded a podcast with Aesthetically Galveston, so I'm going to go ahead and send you to Aesthetically Galveston's podcast feed to check out what they discuss of Galveston's ghosts, haunted buildings, and locations. If you're listening to the audio-only version of this episode, hop on over to YouTube and subscribe to the Galveston Unscripted channel, especially for the interviews. With a lot of these interviews, we are applying photos to supplement the context and the information we're discussing. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it. A little bit different content going on all those platforms. Without further ado, let's hop into this conversation with Kathleen Maca, author of A History of the Galvez Hotel and Galveston's Broadway Cemeteries. Galveston Unscripted, transforming the island into the world's largest free museum.
We used to play this game where somebody would whisper something in somebody else's ear and they would whisper it. And by the time it got back around, it was totally different.
Telephone.
Right.
Telephone.
Okay.
Yeah. We did that in school.
See,
like we'd play
you're
telephone.
younger, so you had telephones. I guess all we had in my day was post offices. But same thing. And on the one hand, as long as it's tourists and they're entertained, that's great.
Yeah.
But if they're going away from the island with misinformation about the historical part of it, that irritates me.
Yeah, it really does irritate me.
People can make up ghost stories wherever, but if you're changing history or saying something happened that didn't or vice versa, that gets my goat.
It does, because it kind of devalues the truth when you start telling all these fabricated things. Like ghost stories is one thing, it's entertainment, but exactly what you just said. The entertainment to the history part, when you start intermingling the two and kind of telling people's blatant lies about this place, it really does bother me. And I think that is kind of one reason why I started this quick, easy fact check. You can go on and
which
your
is awesome.
audio tour map and be like, oh, is that accurate? You know,
JR said,
JR said, and then I cite the resources that I use to state what I said.
Which is great.
So, and I'm hoping to expand that and use technology to make the truth present, if that makes sense. So,
and I think it's just laziness too.
Yeah,
and I realize that a lot of people aren't researching stuff that's not their thing, but Galveston history is so colorful and there are so many fascinating things, whether you're looking for something gruesome or colorful or whatever, you don't have to make it up. Just look it up. But
exactly.
That's too much work, I guess.
Yeah. You're right. Just look it up. You're right.
Yeah.
So let's get this thing rolling. You've already been podcasting for 30 minutes. I'm going to send people over to Aesthetically Galveston's podcast to listen to all of the ghost stories and things you guys talked about. The ghosty stuff. So in this podcast today, we're going to stay away from the ghosty stuff. And I wanted to talk to you about mainly the cemeteries. So one thing I get on my tours are nowhere near a cemetery. Well, I'm sure there were cemeteries there at one point, but my tours are in the downtown district and the East End. But one question I get a lot is, hey, we were driving down Broadway or driving down 61st Street and we saw these cemeteries. Like, what do you know about them? And I'm like, I don't even know where to start because there are so many.
There are so many.
So when someone approaches you on the street or says, hey, you're that lady who wrote that book, how do you even begin to give your spiel about cemeteries here in Galveston?
Well, I tell them if they want to pull up a chair for a couple of hours, we can chat.
Well, perfect.
I've been a cemeterian for most of my life, so cemeteries are my thing. It's not because I'm a goth. Obviously, I don't dress in all black, but I'm fascinated with the history that they represent. So Galveston has so many cemeteries that are easily seen, including the ones on 61st, the ones on Broadway. Rosewood is kind of tucked off of the seawall behind a hotel, earliest African-American designated cemetery. But there are so many that we don't even have anymore. There's some family ranch cemeteries over on the West End. The only one that is still enclosed is the old Stewart family cemetery. But basically, I have to say, what is it about cemeteries that interest you? If I have a group of ladies that come, they probably don't want to hear about all the Civil War soldiers, but I can talk to them for a couple of hours about all the Victorian symbolism in the artwork. And that's fascinating to them. If I have a veterans group, they're going to want to hear all of the war stories. And we have veterans in the Broadway district from 1812 forward. So there's a plethora of stories, including some really heartrending ones. So it kind of depends on what they're interested in and what age level they are. I do tours for the history classes and they're kind of interested in everything. So they're really fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of 1812, so Jean Lafitte had a huge part to play in the War of 1812. And were the people who fought in the War of 1812 from New Orleans? Did they come over with Lafitte?
They came over from all over the place.
From all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay. Just curious.
They were part of the immigrant flow from all directions. Before we had a designated cemetery, we had, the first one was Old City Cemetery, which is just a corner of that big Broadway district that we see. But before they had that, people were kind of buried in the sand dunes because that's where the Indians before us buried their dead. And you can imagine nature's sand dunes, that didn't work too well. But when we had our third yellow fever epidemic, they realized they needed a designated burial ground. And it's a national historic district. It's not just city or state. It's a national historic district, which is really neat.
So taking it back to the early days, right? So you have these Europeans starting to arrive here in Galveston through the Texas Revolution. Was that so? When was that cemetery founded?
Old City and Trinity, which is right across from it, were the 1830s.
Okay.
And they were the first two. And then Old Catholic, which is next to Trinity, was the next one. And then the other ones kind of popped up in the district. But those fields, they were just fields back then. There weren't houses and the other cemeteries didn't exist. Those were utilized mostly as a potter's field, which is where you bury somebody that either can't afford to be buried or can't afford a marker, or maybe they were an outcast of society that you couldn't put them on consecrated ground, but that's where they were buried. So there are so many burials that aren't even marked on the island. It's incredible.
It's actually funny. I walked into the Galveston County Museum and saw right in the main lobby area, there's a gravestone sitting there. And my wife and I had just bought our house and I was looking at this exhibit and I see this gravestone and I go and read it. It's like, this gravestone was found in a backyard on 18th and M.
Fairly recently.
Yeah, recently. And I look at the photo of the back of the house where this gravestone was found and it's my house, the house we had just bought.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. So they found a gravestone there. So we're not 100% sure how it got there. Who knows? I don't know if it was a cemetery before, but
so most likely there are two things that could have happened. The Ott family, who's been stone carving here for 5 generations, and no kidding, the Adams family before them had that company, but there have been other stone carvers or masons here. If they had a mistake on a stone, if they carved the wrong date or something, you can see some of the old stones, they've kind of tried to correct it and not very well, but some of them would throw the stone out and recarve it. It could be that, or it could be a situation of vandalism where sometimes when cemeteries are kind of overrun or not kept, people go in and they steal the stones, flip them upside down, and use them for sidewalks and patios. So they have these marble patios. It's like, that's a suspicious shape.
Yeah.
But yeah, they end up all over the place.
So I don't know if you know this about me. I grew up 57th and Mako. So if you know anything about that street, it is the one street between Seawall and Lakeview.
Oh my gosh.
So we grew up kind of walking around that cemetery, going through it, and very respectfully. And one thing I remember doing was trying to step over where I thought the gravesite was. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to you a few weeks ago, and you mentioned it's like, well, it doesn't really matter. It's like you're probably stepping on someone's gravesite because there have been so many people buried in these cemeteries and kind of mixed and mingled in there.
Yeah. That, in addition to the 1900 storm burials that weren't marked, some were marked, some weren't marked. When I've worked with groups like in East Texas, we can actually use ground penetrating radar, and it comes out where you see kind of like little shadow rectangles so you can find the unmarked graves, and they're all lined up and facing the same way. If you use ground penetrating radar in Old City or in the entire district over there, it looks like somebody's just dropped a bunch of dominoes because they've used dredge fill 3 times during the 20s. So even if they didn't move the marker or anything, imagine what that dredge fill did to the coffin or casket that's underneath. They did that 3 times. And then if a plot ended up not being marked, usually because the marker was lost, they would resell the plot. Mm-hmm. So it just looks like, people are in a jumble. So if in the district, I do try to be respectful. If I go to Glenwood, I am not walking on anybody's grave because they're all perfectly lined up. But in our cemeteries here, pretty much they're under the sidewalk. They're kind of under the street. They're a little bit everywhere. I hope they just know we're there to visit them and don't mind.
So you give your cemetery tours, and that is mainly on Broadway. Is that correct?
It's mainly in the Broadway Cemetery District. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are 7 cemeteries in the Broadway District, and I usually give them in Trinity Episcopal because they were one of the wealthiest congregations, and they have some of the most beautiful statuary to share with people and some great stories. The names that you see on the buildings and the fancy houses that you go through the homes tour are all represented out there. But in the spring, I'll go ahead and start doing Oleander, which is at one end, and Old City, which is another end, and probably Old Catholic. Yeah. Just to mix it up a little bit. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Trinity, and on this podcast before, a few times we've actually spoken about General Magruder and the Lee story of, the father and son story. And the stories get me every time. But
I know.
Could you tell us a little bit about General Magruder's gravestone and then a little bit about some of the others?
Yeah. So General Magruder's is very tall, so it catches your eye right when you walk in the district, and it's beautifully carved. He was basically the general on the Confederate side of the Battle of Galveston, and he was known for trickery. That was his skill, was tricking them into thinking he was doing things that he wasn't. But he was also known for fighting all day and dancing all night. So the ladies in Galveston had fond memories of the general. And when he passed away in Houston, he was penniless, so he was buried in a pauper's grave.
Oh, wow.
And the ladies of Galveston could not have that because they have fond memories of the general. So they retrieved him and brought him back into a donated plot in the city. They also hired a famous sculptor named Pompeo Capini, who did the Alamo Cenotaph and some other famous pieces that you would recognize around the state. And Pompeo Capini designed his marker, but he was too busy with commissions at the time to actually carve it. So the 17-year-old son of the Ott family carved it, which is fascinating when you look at the intricacy, because you can still see smoke coming out of the cannons, and you can still see the hair on the horse's mane, the details. It was such a dense marble. It just hasn't weathered that much. It's an incredible piece of artwork.
On your tours, I know you are probably very fond of a lot of these stories. So a lot of these stories that you have uncovered, I mean, literally through hours and hours and days of research, if not more. What are some of your favorite stories, and what are some of the ones that you want to do more research into?
Oh, there's so many. I'm in the cemetery district all the time and have been for years, but it never fails to fascinate me that I'll walk by a stone and think, why did I never see that one before? And I have countless photos of it. It drives my husband crazy because I'm always photographing and researching. So there's no end to that. When I decided to do the book, though, it would have been so easy to only do the Seeleys and the Willises and the Hutchings. And they're in there because they're fascinating families and they're so important to Galveston. But I wanted to include some people that nobody knew who they were, and they had markers, but nobody remembered them, because that to me was really intriguing. It was more of a mystery. And one of those people was Elizabeth Percival. And she's actually fairly well known now since the book came out. I included her in the book. I included her on tours, started doing lectures, and her story kind of got picked up and adopted. And she's known as the Mardi Gras murder because she was murdered during Mardi Gras. It was a tragic story, but a really touching one. And to this day, when people leave a Mardi Gras parade, they stop by the cemetery district and leave her one of their beads. So year round, she has beads. People leave them at Christmas and Easter and things too. And I love that because now people know who she was, and she was just a lost person for a long time.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff I love.
Yeah. No matter which way you're driving on Broadway, you drive by that cemetery and you look over and it just strikes you. Now, driving through Galveston today, it's like, okay, you see some old restored buildings, but they don't quite align with like, oh, this is what Galveston used to be. It used to be this big, prominent city. There used to be so many very important people here who helped build the state and the United States. When you drive by that cemetery and you see how many huge mausoleums and gravestones and all that is, and knowing that there are possibly 3 layers of that, it strikes you whenever you actually realize that.
We all do better with visuals, I think.
Yeah.
You can read about something, but to see something in person makes more of an impression on you. But yeah, definitely. It's incredible. And I love that during May is when they let the wildflowers go crazy. I've been out there with television crews and things in May, and I always tell them it's kind of like our version of bluebonnets. They let the coreopsis go wild, and people bring their kids and set up gravestones to take the pictures. But the thing I love about it, besides it's just gorgeous and it's a fun time to take pictures out there, is that the people who normally wouldn't come into a cemetery can't resist. They get drawn in by the beauty, and then they start wandering around and saying, oh my gosh, there's a lot to look at out here. And you were talking about the sculptures and the mausoleums. A lot of the mausoleums were designed by some of the most prominent architects of the day, and the wealthier families would actually bring in sculptors from France and Italy and pay them to sculpt these beautiful pieces of art for their family plots. So it's an outdoor art gallery too.
It is. You'll see that in New Orleans a lot, of course. And I think if you've never been to Galveston, and no matter which way you come in, if you're going to the beach, you're either going 61st or Broadway, you're going to see them. You're going to see these mausoleums and these cemeteries. Like I said, I would walk through Lakeview, which is over between 61st Street and 57th Street, and it is gigantic. But as you walk through there, you see names like Burnett, like David G. Burnett, who was the first official president of Texas.
Gresham.
Yes, there. Gresham. Walter Gresham, and all these big names in Texas history. And, after the Revolution, a lot of those guys lived in the Houston, Galveston area, of course, because that's really all there was in Texas, unless you wanted to be a farmer or go ranch somewhere. But it is cool to know that they had a life here, Yeah.
And sometimes you go looking for somebody and realize they might be here, but they might be somewhere else. I know when I read Isaac Storm, I thought, oh, well, I want to go find him. And I found out pretty quickly, he went to New Orleans after Galveston. So a couple of years ago, right before COVID, I went looking for his grave, and he's actually an unmarked grave. And it took me a couple of weeks of research and a field trip out there, but I found it. But it's an unmarked grave. And people that you would think, well, everybody knows who Isaac Klein is, especially because of the book. Why is it unmarked? But you just never know.
So you have 2 books here. Could you tell us about, which one did you write first?
This was the first one.
Galveston's Broadway Cemeteries.
Yes.
When did you write that one?
That's a good question. Half a dozen years ago, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. And so you wrote this, and was this your first?
It was.
Okay. Can you tell me about the process of figuring out, okay, I'm going to write a book about a cemetery?
So I had already done most of the research just because that's what I do is I research cemeteries, and I had been in this one helping with some restoration and cleaning work and stuff. But I always heard that if you can't find the book that you want, write it. And that's exactly what I did. I looked everywhere because it's the Broadway Cemetery District. It has so much history in one place and so many generations. There had to be a book, but I looked everywhere and couldn't find one. So just on a brave day, I guess, I wrote to a publisher and thought, okay, well, when they kick back this proposal, then I'll know, okay, don't do that again. And they called me on the phone when they received it, and they said, yes, how fast can you have it to us?
Oh my gosh.
So that was exciting. I was like, oh, then I have to do it. But I couldn't figure out, because one of the things about going to the cemetery is the stories, and the other thing is the beauty. So I kind of did a mixture as far as the pictures of some photographs of the stones, but also some photographs of the people who were resting there, so you can actually see what they looked like. So it's a kind of a mix.
That is fascinating. I mean, Ed Cottam said the same thing. He went and looked for a book on the Civil War in Galveston,
He's so
and
good.
there wasn't one. And I mean, that's your story exactly. It's like, well, I love this. Why can't I find it? I need to write it. Okay, I'm doing the research
Ready,
anyway,
go.
so I'll put it together. Let's talk about the Hotel Galvez.
That was the most recent release. That one was really fun. That was one that the publisher actually asked me to write.
Oh.
So I was already fascinated with it anyway. So when they asked me if I would, I jumped at the chance and said, yes, don't let anybody do that. I want to do that. I was also under the impression that because it was the Hotel Galvez, there would just be a plethora of information in the archives and in these private collections. And there wasn't. I found out really quickly that because it's had so many owners through the years and a lot of them didn't really care about the history, a lot of the original things have been discarded. They're just nowhere to be found. So it was a dig. That was an archaeological dig to find the things. Once I got rolling, it was good and figured out how I was going to put it together. But I'm writing one about the Tremont now, and it's a totally different experience. There's a lot of information, at least about the most recent Tremont house. So every book is a different experience.
Where did you find most of the information for the Galvez?
Private collections.
How do you do that? So do you have to put out like the bat signal and say, hey, I'm looking for this?
Kind of.
Like, do you have any info on this? Do you
Kind
know
of.
who to target?
Well, you start with Galveston, the people you
Of
know in
course.
Galveston,
Yeah.
and you start spreading the word. I'm looking for this, and if your family has any connection to it, whatever. And then once the word kind of got out a little bit, I was contacted by family members of former managers of the Galvez from like when I was little and stuff. So it was fun. And in traveling and doing shows and book signings and stuff, people would approach me and say, I have something I want to show you about the Galvez. And it's like, yes, sit down right now, this minute.
That's
So
awesome.
a lot of it was just kind of backdoor information. There was a period where the Galvez was the White House of the nation because FDR was down here for 10 days. It's kind of like Camp David. Anytime the president goes somewhere for that length of time, the White House kind of follows him.
Oh,
and
wow.
they took over the 6th floor was the secretarial bay, and they had extra phone lines and telegraph lines. They had the mail planes coming in every day into Shoals Air Force Field. It was quite the undertaking and the big sweep of what became the Secret Service before that, which was fascinating. So the first place I contacted was the FDR's presidential library. They found one scribbled phone message, and they said, we have no record of that ever happening. And I was so distraught because I
Oh,
thought
my gosh.
if anybody would have it, they would have. So
Yeah.
that took a while. But then once I started hitting the mother lode, you just start going down rabbit holes, praying you're going to find things. And
Yeah.
sometimes you find really juicy little tidbits.
Of course. Straighten me out on one thing. Okay. Is it Tremont or Tremont?
It depends on who you ask.
Okay. Because I've always said Tremont.
Yeah, I've always said Tremont, but there are people who say Tremont, and I kind of bounce back and forth now. I have not come up with, I will have the definitive answer by the time the book comes out.
Okay.
But the one in Boston that it's named after is Tremont.
So maybe I should start saying Tremont.
But we're already saying Tremont.
We are in Texas. So
I
it's
know.
like, eh.
We got to say Tremont.
Yeah. Well, it was here. I mean, that was in the United States. When it opened, it was in Texas. So completely separate entities at that point. Oh my gosh. You're starting with version 1 in the 1830s.
Yeah. There have been 3 major Tremonts. There have been a couple of others that weren't major Tremonts, all in Galveston. It's starting before statehood. And so the book will go through the history of all of it, and then how, of course, they ended up in the building they're in, which was once a part mercantile and part hotel, but now it's one really large luxury hotel. But it's kind of fascinating, the things that it's gone through. I found a lot of fun things that I can't wait to share in the book. I'm a big buff of the Wild West. I have been since I was a kid.
Yeah.
So I had always heard that Buffalo Bill had stayed in the second Tremont, the one that you see a lot of the old pictures of. And I thought, I have to prove or disprove that. I just have to know. And they were there. The whole Wild West show was there.
Oh,
It was
wow.
just incredible. So I can't wait to share some photos and things.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's just, I was so excited.
Are those actually accessible, or do you have to find access to these photos, or will
You
they
have
be
to
so they will
They'll be in the book.
Awesome.
But yeah.
So it'll be like a first look to actually see these photos.
some of the things that are in there.
Yeah. That's so cool.
It's really fun.
A few things that fascinate me are photos that it's the first time they're actually available to the public when you actually put them out in books. And a lot of times these books, it's like, unless you know to go buy this book, you're not going to actually find that
Right.
photo, or unless you know exactly what you're looking for. But also another thing is, whenever someone finds a collection in their attic, their great grandfather's collection, and they open it up and they're like, oh, maybe we should get these digitized, and they give them to somebody to digitize them, and then next thing you know, they show up on the portal to Texas history or the Rosenberg Library, and you're like, wait, I've been sifting through these files for years, and all of a sudden this is in there, and they're right there. So
and it happens every time. When the Galvez book came out, something like presented itself, and it was like, it's already at the publisher. Yeah. Dang it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, where was the first location?
We're still trying to pin that down. We know the general area because it was only within a couple of blocks of the second one.
Okay.
But it's been really hard to pinpoint, because even in the old newspapers, they would just give on 23rd Street. It's like, that's not helping me.
Okay, so then the second rendition was 23rd and Church. So the first one must have been somewhere.
Yeah, it's got to be close.
On 23rd,
it had to be close.
Yeah. And did they name Tremont Street for that hotel?
They did.
Okay.
The first one.
The first
one had to be on 23rd somewhere. We just aren't sure quite yet what block. Yeah, the archives asked me that the other day, and I was like, I'm still searching.
Yeah. One thing I did want to touch on before we get too far away from cemeteries, Rosewood.
Yes.
Rosewood Cemetery.
Yes.
And I know there are some other cemeteries that were lost or covered up. So can we start with Rosewood? And can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Okay, so Rosewood's now owned by GHF, or the Galveston Historical Foundation. That was the first designated African-American burial ground. And when I first came across it, maybe 20 years ago, and I'd need to find those photos. It had a lot of stones and markers and some above ground graves still in it. Today, it hardly has anything left in it. Some of that's due to weather events. A lot of it's due to vandalism. GHF representative has just told me, though, that they have a grant in place, and they're actually going to build a walkway, kind of a viewing platform, and some more informational pieces that people can actually go and view what's left and kind of visualize what was there and the history behind it, because it was very important. The African Americans were buried other places. Sometimes they were buried in the family plots of the people who they worked for. I know Uncle Newton, who was a character back in the day, was one of the grave diggers for Trinity Episcopal, and he also pumped the organ bellows for the church on Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Always wore a stovepipe hat to work. He's quite a character. But he's buried in Trinity Episcopal.
Oh, wow.
If his grave was ever marked, it's been lost. So there wasn't like a total segregation as far as burial, but that was the first designated. So it's very important to Galveston history.
It's very far west.
It's kind of behind by a hotel.
Yeah. Nowadays you drive back there, and it's kind of on the rear facing edges of all these buildings in between seawall and some hotels and other buildings. And immediately the first thing you notice is how low the ground is. So it has never been elevated, that cemetery. So it kind of does two things. It exemplifies how tall the seawall is and how low that ground would have been.
Once Ike hit, they were just looking for low-lying ground to dump trash in. And Rosewood had an issue with that because it just looks like this big empty lot, so people were just dumping trash in. And I think that's when some of the damage got done as well. It's my impression.
Yeah, and that's one of my things with historic preservation now. Do you just leave it there to kind of just like disappear, and then whenever there's a storm you just throw trash in it? Or do you spend the time to go in there and preserve it and at least protect it? So if there is something where a dump truck's driving through just looking for open land, you're not just going to dump something in there. So it's one of those things that really gets me going when we talk about historic preservation, and I'm really glad that GHF has a hand in it now, so at least we can start. Yeah,
they'll do what's right because they'll be respectful for it. Now, the one that you're talking about disappearing, there are a lot of them that have disappeared, especially the smaller family cemeteries. But probably the big one that you're talking about is Magnolia Grove, and that's where a lot of the wealthier people were buried. It was actually a sculptured park setting cemetery, kind of like they had on the East Coast during the Victorian era. It had hills and everything, which you don't picture in Galveston. 100 varieties of trees, 100 varieties of flowering shrubs were imported and planted there.
Wow.
The monuments were beautiful. There's only one existing picture of it, but it kind of fell into disrepair. And then when World War II came, Shoals Airport was built, and the cemetery is now underneath. Half of it is underneath the runway to Shoals Air Force Field, and half of it is under the 18th green of Moody Gardens Golf Course.
Oh my gosh.
And to my knowledge, they only moved 3 graves. Mrs. Rogers and her 2 children were moved to Oleander in the Broadway Cemetery District. But those are the only ones that I have actually found documentation that they moved.
How many books have you written now?
I'm going on number 5.
You're going on number 5. If you want to know anything about Galveston history, no matter what part of the island it is, no matter what aspect, you go to Kathleen.
Big blanket.
Yeah, but you know it, or you know exactly who to ask. So I know in this one we really covered cemeteries, but is there anything else you love or like or want to say about Galveston and its history?
I love all of it. I mean, it's so varied that it's kind of, when I was talking earlier about how I can kind of hone the tours depending on what your interest is, you can do that with anything about Galveston. You can do it if you're walking down the Strand. You can do it if you're looking at the older homes, but you don't really like architecture. There are stories that you can pull that will make those people all of a sudden interested in those neighborhoods. It's just so multi-layered and fascinating. There's just no end to it. And you could keep me talking forever.
Yeah.
And I always want to hear everybody else's stories.
Yes, I know. Yeah, just always constantly curious.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no reason to make up stories, y'all. No reason.
Stop it.
Kathleen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to leave a link to all your books in the description.
I appreciate it.
And we will have to get on here again.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening in to Galveston Unscripted. If you enjoyed this conversation with Kathleen Maca, hop on over to Aesthetically Galveston's podcast feed. They discuss hauntings and ghost stories. Not really what I'm into, but it is one of those things Galveston is known for nonetheless. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you know of anyone visiting Galveston Island anytime soon, let them know about Galveston Unscripted's audio tour. 100% free. All you got to do is Google Galveston Unscripted. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on Facebook. We are always putting out content, making sure we enhance your understanding of Galveston, Texas, and American history. Thank you for your support, transforming Galveston into the world's largest free museum. And we'll see you next time on Galveston Unscripted. For historic resources or more information, check out the episode description.